Hi class, welcome to our video about confirmation bias. Here is a mountain. It is the mountain Mount Hood in Oregon, in the Pacific Northwest, a topic that's going to come up near the end of this video. Let's get started. As said, the topic for this video is confirmation bias. As you can see, we have a big fat X through this. This is also something that should make sense by the end of this video. Now, here we have a definition. The key here is to learn how to take a concept like this and really expand it so that it applies not only to the world around us, but more specifically to the readings that we have this semester. So here is our overall definition, the one that really we can sink our teeth into, and it comes from one of our readings this semester and one you'll want to refer to as you work on paper number 1. It is the tendency to process information by looking for or interpreting information that is consistent with one's beliefs. Okay, so the big question here is how information and beliefs work together to form a worldview, sometimes in conflict with some actual larger truth. That is, that sometimes information is sought out which supports our beliefs, even if it's not true, and more specifically, that we look for information that supports beliefs that are very important to us, that are highly important, that are self-relevant. And the implication of this is that inconsistent information is often ignored, denied, and or aggressively challenged. What we want to think about here in this lecture discussion, or video rather, is what this looks like when we aggressively challenge or ignore information that seems to be right in front of us and be challenging what we believe, but really we are willfully choosing to be ignorant about this information. And throughout, we're going to use 2 examples to really make sense of this. One would be from your childhood, perhaps, certainly from my childhood, and one is from the world around us as we're understanding it in more and more concerning ways. So, the first belief is that the tooth fairy is real, and our second one is that global warming or climate change, but we're going to stick with the phrase global warming, does not exist. The tooth fairy is real, global warming doesn't exist. Now, what we want to explore is how people would hold on to either of those beliefs. And one way that goes about is when we consider these beliefs, as we said, highly important or self-relevant. So, in this example, consider our believer, the person who believes in the tooth fairy and the non-existence of global warming. Okay, so these are 2 different people, but for the first person, they believe that buying chocolate bars is awesome. That is a very important thing to this person. As for this other individual, they support the Republican candidate for president because one agrees with the candidate's beliefs. That is very important to this person's worldview, that if they choose to support the Republican president for candidate, that he and this individual agree on the same belief system. That's a very important thing for this person. So, what does that add up to? It adds up to this equation, which is it's important to get chocolate bars, and one way I can get chocolate bars is by putting a tooth under my pillow after I lose it, because afterwards, right? So let's read it out loud. The tooth fairy must be real because when I received $5 after losing a tooth, which apparently came from this tooth fairy, I was able to buy 4 chocolate bars. So that's a sort of how you get into the equation here, which is that your belief system is thinking always about the prize and sort of works backwards in order to make sense of how possibly all this leads to the tooth fairy. In the case of global warming must not exist because the Republican candidate for president says it doesn't exist. Since it is highly important for me to support a Republican candidate because he agrees with my beliefs, this global warming must not be real. So here, because you believe in the Republican Party and you believe in believing in the Republican Party, that you and this party's candidate believe in the same thing, you find yourself believing that global warming doesn't exist. So again, it's all about the connection between these two things in order to get to this belief system. That is the argument really being emphasized by this notion that values trump inconsistent information. That will ultimately lead you to believe that something is true even if it's not necessarily true, or if there's information which is inconsistent. Now, I don't think that is something that is utterly shocking for people to hear. But what I think this is worth discussing for, why I think it's worth discussing, is because of the ways that we go about getting to that point where we believe in these things that aren't necessarily true, right? How do we get there? And the more that we start to look around at the things as we see them, you start to sort of see these ways, these methods, these sort of habits that people develop in order to get through their daily lives, which is something discussed in the reading about the ocean, the idea that it's an efficient way to process information. So there's these ways that we go through it. And we have this great, colorful quote from a 19th century writer, Mackay, wherein he, discussing the Salem witch trials, he says, when men wish to construct or support a theory, how they torture facts into their service. In other words, that we make facts bend in such a way that they are convenient for us. And here, the key, I won't read this whole quote out loud, but the key here is this notion that information is often ignored or given little consideration. People give special treatment to information that supports their personal beliefs. Now, there's a few of these critical thinking questions here and elsewhere that we'll be discussing, and the importance of them is to consider them the kinds of questions that you will want to answer in both this class and in your daily life. What does this special treatment look like? How does a person go about, quote, torturing facts, end quote, in order to support their personal ethical, political, cultural, or otherwise considered personal beliefs, right? Because ethical, political, and cultural beliefs can be personal, but you can also have other personal beliefs. So what does that look like? And another question, or another thing to consider, is this notion of impression formation, which is really about what you think first. So that if people are told what to expect from a person or something in the world they are about to meet, though, so from a person they're about to meet, such as that person is warm, friendly, and outgoing, people will look for information that supports this expectation because this is what they think this person will be like. They look for information to support that. And of course, if you hear terrible things, you would do the same thing. And another critical thinking question is that if this impression formation makes it difficult to change one's impression about something, even after new information challenges this original impression, why is that? And do people act differently when they're attempting to cling to a belief which has been challenged? And that, again, is a type of question that you're going to want to explore on your own in your writing. But let's get back to our example. So, here we have two examples of belief challengers in which we find this information which is inconsistent with our beliefs. The tooth fairy wrote me a nice note, but I don't think any sort of fairy wrote this. Isn't that my mom's handwriting? Has my mom been the one dropping cash on me whenever I drop a tooth? So you see this, and this actually happened to me, where I saw my mom's handwriting, and I was like, wait a minute, this tooth fairy must not exist. And the big thing there is that that's a challenge to your belief. And it's a challenge to your belief that you're like, is this tooth fairy thing made up? Is this in some ways challenging what I've come to believe about how I can most easily get chocolate? But to a much more serious, everyday, these days type of example, consider the example of a man from Florida who has lived there and has started to see floods and hurricanes and insect-borne diseases happening at a ever more frequently happening. And apparently rising sea levels, radical changes in the atmosphere, and the destruction of wildernesses areas are consequences of global warming, and each of these in turn have led to floods, hurricanes, and diseases. In other words, that high sea levels, of course, lead to floods. Hurricanes also cause floods. radical changes in the atmosphere cause hurricanes. Diseases can be connected to changes in wilderness areas, which is what happened in the relationship to the pandemic. So you start to think about those things and you find out that you have dengue fever, your house has been flooded, and even more recently that your boat sank. None of this stuff has ever happened before, and this would seem to challenge your non-belief in global warming, right? You thought global warming did not exist, you believe it doesn't exist, and yet you feel more and more these things happening. You feel the sense of what you might call a pattern emerging. And the challenge then comes up against your own values. The question is how do you go about challenging those values? How do you get to a point when you can deal with this contradiction? And as we said, it's this notion of fact torturing. We find ways to construct or support a theory by giving special treatment to the information which helps support theories or things that we value above all else. So, in the example of the tooth fairy, denying the existence of the tooth fairy means that I might not get candy-buying funds whenever I drop the tooth, so I will just say the tooth fairy exists. In fact, sometimes we take it even further. We double down on this fact torturing. In fact, I'm going to get more excited than ever by saying that I love the note that the tooth fairy wrote me, that I can't wait to get another note written in such an elegant script, so that we almost completely bend over backwards and double down on the thing that looks like it's not true and make it seem like it's evidence that it's actually true. Example 2, I am passionate about politics, and I am even more than that highly invested in my support of the Republican Party. The president of this party, in response to whether or not he believes there's a link between the historically unprecedented fires, which are now and have been destroying vast swaths of the Pacific Northwest, and global warming, are linked. And he responded by saying, it's going to start getting cooler. You just watch. This climate denier asks, does this mean I can't support this candidate? And again, to finish the thought about fact torturing and doubling down, although this doesn't make sense to me, it's more important to me to share the beliefs with this candidate than it is to hold the global warming thing, to believe in this global warming thing. I therefore will choose to not only believe the global environmental disaster does not exist, but aggressively challenge anyone who says anything to the contrary. And we don't really have time to get into examples of what this looks like, but I suspect you may know what that looks like. And if you don't, that's what you're going to want to start looking around the world at. Looking around the readings at the world around you and asking yourself, what does it look like when a person tries to, or a person or a group tries to believe in something that they don't really believe? What does the world around us look like when groups, large and small, practice this type of bias? In other words, what are the consequences of small groups and large groups choosing to think habitually in this fashion? Okay, so that is our discussion about the concept of confirmation bias, and it's something to keep in mind as a concept as we travel throughout this semester. All right, until next time.